is going on in Canadian universities, particularly at this time of COVID? A lot of families are concerned that their children are paying full ride to go back to school, but what are they getting if they're sitting in their rooms on their computers getting an education? We're going to take a look at some of those issues, but also kick it up to 30,000 feet and see what the future of education is. Are universities actually doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of a contribution to society? So we have with us today the president of the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Peter Stoicheff. Welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Really good to see you. I was warning him that we were going to try and have this very high-level esoteric conversation, but I still want to start with the basic numbers here, that even in the middle of COVID, you've got an increase in your enrollment. What accounts for that?
Yeah, I know. We were expecting back in about early July, before the numbers started rolling in a more final way, we were thinking, we could see a decrease of as much as 15%. That was a scenario we were working with, a decrease of 7% flat. We weren't really expecting an increase, but, I think there are a lot of things that come into play here. One of them is that prospective students or students who are already with us who otherwise might have taken a year off don't really have great job prospects. They can't really travel the world. And a university is an attractive, alternative. But the other thing that I find more interesting than all of that is that with the remote delivery, there's way more access.
Right.
There are people who otherwise can't physically get to a university, and usually you have to be able to in order to take courses. And suddenly they find that they can access the university. So I think that's a part of it too.
So you may be educating a different kind of person. That may be a mother with kids at home or somebody that's already in the workforce that's looking to do this on their own time.
That's right. Yeah. And maybe working away slowly at a degree. All of these things suddenly become options instead of, let's say, living in a very remote community and saying, I've got to disrupt my whole life to get down to Saskatoon to take a degree there. Suddenly, I don't have to do that. So I think that's a part of it. And I'm sure we'll be talking later on about what the future holds for universities, but that'll be part of it.
And what you see there is a different kind of student, because I'm thinking about the kids that didn't really finish grade 12 because everything shut down in March or April. They didn't have that closure. They have no understanding of what university life is. You don't know till you get there. You have all these preconceptions. And whether they're going to feel really dislocated, the experience of being on campus is that one-on-one contact with the other kids, sitting in a big classroom, making friendships. That's all disappearing.
That's all gone, for this year.
Really? Do you think that this is not just COVID hastening the inevitable?
So we'll have to see, but I don't think the concept of what we colloquially call the university without walls is going to, make a grand entrance post-COVID. I think what we're going to see is more people who will study remotely, but still lots of people on campus, because exactly like you say, they want that experience. They want a connection with their colleagues. They want a connection with the faculty. They want to see, older students and see where they are maybe going, check out whether they want to go to grad school. Yeah, all of that stuff. So I don't really see that vanishing.
So you're being optimistic then that probably in a year, by next fall. What's your plan for January? Is this still going to be a remote year?
Still going to be remote. In fact, we're sitting here today on, the 16th, and we just made that announcement a couple of days ago. And we had to wait. We wanted to be sure. I mean, we'd like to be more open if we possibly could, but, the health of everybody is the main determinant of this. So we don't see that things are magically going to change midnight December 31st. So we made an announcement it's going to be mostly remote. But, go back to that other topic you were raising, MOOCs, massive online courses. They were a rage as much as 10 years ago. They're a brilliant idea. And some of the ones that I watched were spectacular. But the expectation was that they would profoundly change post-secondary education. And I don't think they have profoundly changed post-secondary education. So it tells us there's still this desire for human contact.
My niece was telling me she's in business school, and the professor was going to deliver these pre-prepared lectures by YouTube, right? Via YouTube. So it wasn't a live experience. And then he kind of came back to the point, which is, I just can't sit here and talk into a camera or into a microphone for 1 hour, droning on when there's no interaction, or it's very difficult, especially if it's just a downloaded experience, if it's a live experience. So maybe there just needs to be some massaging of all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing that'll happen, speaking to his experience, is what we call the flipped classroom. So the idea that maybe a faculty member would be sending out all of those things in advance, pre-recorded. Students can watch them whenever they want in advance of then getting together, but talking about it.
For that hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're still together. There's still that desire to get together, and they'll be together. But instead of listening to, what we like to call the sage on the stage up there, they will have already done that.
Right.
And now's the time to really question it, critique it, really work with it. So that doesn't mean students won't be getting together. It's just they'll be getting together under slightly different circumstances.
There's some of the classes in which you must keep your video and audio on at all times in these live situations. So the professor actually knows it's you, that you're alive. You're not curling your hair or, doing puzzles. Is that fair? Is that a reasonable way? Say, look, we need to know that you're actually participating.
I hadn't thought of that before. I confess, that would take me. It's not the way I would run a class if I were a faculty member. I mean, often, so I was an English prof, Pamela.
Yeah.
And we used to give out a percentage of a mark for sort of class participation and that kind of thing. It didn't mean taking attendance. It just meant, by and large, were you an influence?
Right.
On the learning that was going on in the class, right? And
Did you speak once in the school year?
Yeah, but I mean, were you showing up somehow or other?
Yeah.
It wasn't in terms of attendance, but in terms of engagement.
So that's a fair assessment that should be part of this in some way or another.
I think for a smaller class, I'm talking there about seminars. I mean, when you're into large lectures, it's totally up to the student, whether
they want to.
Yeah, how they want to bring in the information.
That's the thing. It's not like you're at home and the teacher cares whether you do your homework. No, when you're at university, you're on your own. Yeah. What do you say to the parents who say, look, tuition has been steadily rising. The students protest about it at every university every year. And they're getting less than what they were if they were there in person, meeting those other people, making connections, making contacts, having that group experience, having events on campus. Is it worth it?
We have had those questions a lot, and not just at the University of Saskatchewan. I know that that's a question that everybody's looking at across the country. So my answer to that is, first of all, let's hope, everybody, that this is relatively brief. I mean, in terms of a 4-year degree that might take 4 or 5 years to complete, this is 1 year. And I don't mean to shirk the question there, but what I really mean by that is the value of your degree is not going to be decreased. I don't anticipate an employer saying to you, well, you went to the University of Saskatchewan, but there was that 1 year where it wasn't face-to-face, and so I don't have as much confidence in you. I think the value is going to be as high. U15 University, one of the major research ones, great faculty, great programs, all that quality is there. The experience that you've had for that, let's hope, 1 year, that's subjective. And as I say, I'd balance off the fact that some people think that it might not be as rich an experience with the fact that suddenly many other people can access us who couldn't before. So what we did, though, at the University of Saskatchewan, we did this through the post-secondary sector in the province, was hold tuition at zero. So typically we increase it a little bit each year, 1%, 2%, 3%, depends on the program that you're in. We don't just have a tuition that's set for everybody at the same level. And this year we determined, University of Regina did this, Saskatchewan Polytechnic did this as well, that we'd keep it at zero. So that was our, let's say, concession, not to the fact that quality would be different, but that students weren't able to, go out and find the sort of summer jobs and so on that would enable them to handle a slight increase in tuition.
You talked about whether or not the public, a potential employer, even the university itself, looking at young professors, shouldn't take this 1 year as a decrease in quality or a decrease in the value. But there's plenty written about the whole idea of qualification inflation. You used to be able to get a job when you had a grade 10 education, then you needed a grade 12. Then getting a BA was a big deal. Now, if you don't have an MA, don't even walk in the door. Are we kind of overproducing a highly educated elite for jobs that may or may not exist?
Well, the whole connection between what you're learning at a university and what the job market needs is a really fascinating one. I don't think we're producing elites. And, as you say, many, many more students go to university now than did before. I mean, in my time, I think it was something like 10% of the high school graduating class when, now it's more like 50. What I see is that the working world gets more and more complex. The needs of employers and the requirements of their employees get more and more complex. Not only do you need to know how to do a certain job, you need to know how to work in groups, how to communicate, all of those used to be called soft skills. I prefer to call them human skills. And so this really speaks to lifelong learning to me. So yeah, university's part of it, a BA, a master's, maybe a PhD. But also think about all the people whose jobs have been completely disrupted or have disappeared. And universities have to become the right place for them to be able to come back to upskill for whatever lies in store for them. So I don't think people are being overeducated for a job market. I think the job market's changing so swiftly and so dramatically for a whole bunch of reasons that were in existence even before COVID, that continual education is becoming an imperative in a person's life.
But does that implicitly mean that the degree at whatever level is less value than it used to be? If you're saying 10% used to go on to further education, then having a degree meant something. It was a little more rare. Now, if everybody and their dog can get a BA, and then that's kind of the starting point, is it really worth what it once was?
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument to be made for the fact that if you have an undergraduate degree, you're part of a much larger group that has the same degree, and so you don't stand out for an employer as much. But at the same time, I wouldn't, attach getting a degree directly one-to-one to whether or not you're marketable. I mean, there are lots of other reasons to go to university, than to suddenly be able to get a particular kind of job. You grow. And when you grow intellectually and you grow in terms of all of these human skills that we could talk about further if you'd like, I think that's just a wonderful thing on its own.
Are you producing the right kind of people, right kind of skill set in the people that graduate? I was reading a study, I think it was a British study, looking at what happens when someone graduates with a degree and what happens societally. Social mobility hasn't really improved that much. The contribution to GDP is not that clear. In our country, our own productivity, we know the numbers are not good relative to our trading partners. So if we're not hitting those marks, what are we doing?
Yeah. So I go back to something like on the OECD Innovation Index, we're at the top of the bottom third. And, for a country such as ours that enjoys all of the wonderful things that we enjoy, for us to be in that place is just untenable. And universities do have a role to play in that. On that side of things, it's more, I think, that university research needs to be able to connect up more with, let's say, market needs and an innovation agenda of the whole country. That's a whole other story. And I think there's a gap there that needs to be closed, and universities have a role to play.
And then that creates another problem, which is, are you doing business with corporations? Does that influence your work. I was reading something just the other day about the impact of China and Chinese money and Chinese corporations coming in and funding research in universities for their own defense purposes, not our educative purposes.
Yeah. So you have to be very careful when you're dealing with a company that wants you to help them with research, that you have a watertight contract that prevents the misuse of research or anything that would, of course, be reputationally negative for you. But, back to how we train students. I mean, I think the message that we have heard, and a lot of this is contained in a wonderful report by RBC called Humans Wanted, that we're not. That universities need to be much more alert to what employers require and actually what their own graduates need in order to be successful in the workplace. That's the first thing. Secondly, universities need to rethink the whole concept of degrees and certificates and diplomas that take a long time to complete, and instead also, start offering what we call micro-credentialing. So very, very small courses and very small sort of programs, small in terms of the number of courses and short in terms of the timeline, so that people can turn around and get back out into the workforce. And I think that's not happening all that well either. And these are the great questions that I think alert universities and alert university leaders need to really pay attention to.
I mean, we've seen a little bit of it with executive MBAs because people can't leave the workforce for 3 years to go get an MBA, but they can take 6 weeks or 3 weeks in some form. So you're saying expand that for people who are in the workforce already.
Exactly. There are lots of, or people who have been in the workforce and suddenly find that they're not, and have to think very differently about what kind of training they have.
So the universities do need to be there, obviously, for people who were in the workforce and want to come, as you say, for shorter periods of time. But you're also talking about creating a different kind of graduate and maybe more of a focus on EQ instead of IQ or both. How do you see that issue?
Yeah. So, traditionally, different kinds of programs, particularly professional programs, have looked at what is needed in the workforce in terms of, let's call them hard skills. So an accountant has to know, how to do accounting and so on. And typically the program wouldn't necessarily move very far beyond that. I think what we know we need now is what I've already referred to as the human skills. So being able to work in groups, an understanding of what leadership takes, an understanding of communication, and all of those things, what traditionally had been called and I think dismissed as the soft skills. And we're realizing now that that's what's necessary. But also, you take a look at the great challenges that the world faces today. You could enumerate them better than I could. But if we even take a look at something like the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, somebody like Volker Gertz at Arvido Intervac is working hard on developing a vaccine. But there's a whole world out there that is dealing with this on a communications level, a politicized level, all of these other things that university training in different ways of seeing, different ways of imagining, different ways of approaching a problem can really help with. And universities, I think, just need to get more deliberate about developing those skills, not just hoping that somehow off there or indirectly they might happen.
So how do you go about that? What's the strategy to do that?
So I think in our case, what we're going to be doing, and COVID is sort of the exclamation mark on all of this, but a lot of what we're talking about was being discussed before COVID. It's just COVID, I think, has created a greater sense of urgency and clarity about it. So what we'd like to do is have an institution-wide conversation at the University of Saskatchewan about what we need to look like post-COVID. What are the changes that we need to make? And I think that the best way to have that conversation is to, first of all, go out there and talk with all kinds of other sectors beyond the university and not ask them so much, what do you need of a University of Saskatchewan, but how is your experience changing in your particular sector? And then bring that information and start asking ourselves how we can best respond to that.
We're going to need a whole new department of anthropology and demography to just look at what we've learned about ourselves in this very intense situation, how we behave, what it means if you're not going to be able to socially interact the way we do. What are those kids going into grade 1 going to be like?
Yeah. And, you've hit on something there that I think is really important. And I say this a lot to the humanities and to the social sciences every opportunity I get, that there is an increasing role of influence for the humanities and the social sciences for exactly the things that you were just discussing. That what the world is going to need in the 21st century is not exclusively scientific and medical discoveries, but all of those other things that you learn through the humanities and the social sciences, understanding religious difference, having an ability with different languages, understanding political differences, understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion. These things are not understanding how to make this country a better place with Indigenous people. These things are not scientific discoveries, and they're imperative. They're more imperative now than they've ever been, and universities have a role to play, and that role can be played partly in the humanities and the social sciences.
And we're seeing some other things on university campuses, just thinking even back to my own days. Of course, everybody's a bit of a radical when they go to university. They're naive. They think they can change the world, all of those things. Today, we're seeing extremes more reflected, whether it's preventing people from speaking. This is near and dear to my heart, free speech, that whole notion that we now don't want the presence of other people. We won't tolerate people that we don't agree with. There may be statues torn down. How are you going to deal with that part of what's going on in society at large that's also being reflected on campuses at a time when you're supposed to be opening minds, not closing? Yeah,
this is a huge challenge. So, at the University of Saskatchewan, I've always felt that there are many speakers, let's say, who might have been turned away at other institutions under other circumstances that would not have been turned away here. I don't see us turning away, or in the past having turned away a Jordan Peterson, let's say. I just don't think that that's appropriate. I think students are absolutely well prepared to hear anything like that and make their own decisions.
Well, and if you don't want to hear it, stay at home.
and you don't have to be there anyway.
Right,
but
right.
I mean, these are parts of civil discourse. I think where you have to draw the line is when you are talking about hate speech and outright racism and all those other things. But otherwise, I don't know about a high level of tolerance, but there's a high capacity for people to withstand hearing and engaging in the debate with these things. The other thing that's really fascinating, I go back to when I was a student in the 70s at universities, was watching my peers and my faculty, the people I took courses from, engaging in really, really difficult conversations and seeing how they did it. And that was really, really important for me, and I'm sure was really important for everybody else in any of those rooms listening. So I don't think we should lose that, but we have to draw a line. I mean, there are things that can be said that should not be tolerated. It's just we have to have a safe space where somebody can stand up and say, we don't tolerate this.
Because my sense is, and I get this obviously secondhand, I've been through university. It wasn't that we didn't have this similar issues then, just seems so much more intense and we're seeing it in the world of journalism, that people are expressing opinion rather than information. I want history taught. I don't want your view of history taught to me, or your view of political science, or your view of the players that are now. It's hard to monitor that. It's hard to step on that when this is supposed to be about the widest possible range of ideas and thought.
Well, I think there is a large space, a lot of room for interpretation at university. I mean, go back to the humanities. The humanities is a lot about interpretation as opposed to about rote fact. But I think universities have a responsibility at the same time to ensure that facts are there. So go back to the COVID world that we're living in for the moment. The fact that we made masks mandatory on a university campus was not actually particularly controversial. And I think it's because people understand that at a university, there are a lot of people who understand what the facts are and that masks are a good thing to make mandatory in potentially social situations. So I think there is a reverence for a university's ability to distinguish what is right and what is wrong. You know, I often talk about, and my predecessor as a president, Peter McKinnon, was the one who made this point, that there's a difference between freedom of speech and academic freedom. And, you know, in the academy, you don't actually have the freedom to argue that the world is flat. Mm-hmm. You can stand out there on the street corner and say, that's my opinion. That's freedom of speech.
Right.
But in the academy, we are talking about what we think we know and what we can prove by replicating results in experiments or whatever that discipline's version of the truth is. And of course, that can be contested all the time, but you have to bring that truth to bear. So we talk about academic freedom, and you know, I don't have, that doesn't give me the freedom as an English professor to walk into a geology class and insist that the world is flat, and have some authority by virtue of being a professor to do so.
But the role of the professor or the university writ large as interpreter of history or the provider of context, I mean, maybe those are the two different things. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But this is where students play a huge role too. I mean, you know, I had the experience of learning as much from my students my fellow students in a class too, because some prof would be standing there saying X and they'd be saying, well, Y or Z. And often, and I had this experience as a faculty member all the time. I mean, there is no way I could have, let's say, brought the quality of thought to bear on the stuff I was researching and publishing if I had not tried it out in a classroom and
got the pushback
and been flexible. There is just no way I could have, quote unquote, done it on my own. And I don't think anybody in an intellectual setting really thinks in a vacuum. Yeah. There's a lot of give and take.
That comes back to the question of the virtual learning, because if you're sitting in a classroom beside a young girl that comes from a small town in Saskatchewan and you happen to be the son of, a very, very wealthy elite manufacturing, you're going to learn from each other there, and that exchanges go on. If you're sitting on a computer, you may not even know where that person is or who they are or what their mom and dad do.
Yeah, I know. So, I mean, and I've noticed this actually just in my version of WebEx meetings and you know, those kinds of meetings, that people do tend to be quieter, and the whole situation is more transactional, and a lot of information flow and a lot of learning is not just through a transactional, agendaed kind of gathering. So, you know, so I don't disagree with that, but I think if I were a faculty member, I'd be encouraging people, you know, on the Hollywood Square screen in front of me to all, you know, connect up and push back. I bet they do.
I gave a speech last week on WebEx, and it all worked technically, but it was a bizarre feeling because you realize how much you rely on that face sitting in the audience to give you some feedback about you're going on too long, you're getting boring, move it along, or that they've really understood your point. Yeah.
Oh, it's like recording music in a studio, you know, that's acoustically sound and therefore flat and nobody's there.
Right.
It's sometimes hard to, you know, get into the zone.
I was reading a piece the other day, and this is an age-old question. I served as a chancellor in a university, so I do know how much the need for financial support dominates. University presidents spend 80-90% of their time trying to fund the university, even with tuition going up. On the other hand, you've got people saying the university sector is drunk on debt, that they're borrowing, that they're fundraising, that they're accumulating real estate, et cetera. Where in there is the balance?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah, you are. You have to always be concerned about the financial challenges that face universities. And, for your listeners who don't know, I mean, our Constitution says that education is primarily a provincial responsibility, like health.
Yeah.
And so we have a federal government, and we've had successive federal governments. The current Liberal government has been very supportive in this way. Its predecessor was very supportive in its own way. The federal government has supported research in this country at universities. Right. And there are programs actually that Harper put in that we're still benefiting from. There are programs that Trudeau's government has put in that we're benefiting from. But the sort of operating costs of a university education and what a university needs to run itself, that's a provincial jurisdiction. And, I mean, the thing is, we don't have, I know this is a controversial statement, but compared to some place like the United States, for instance, our tuition is relatively moderate. And we're really, we're really serious about that. So at our university, for instance, we have 5 different principles that we invoke in order to figure out where tuition should go in any given year. And they're about, on the one hand, you want high quality. On the other hand, you want accessibility. You want predictability. You want comparability so that we're not way out of line with a particular program's tuition compared to any other university you could take a similar program at. And so these 5 principles really help to refine where we are with tuition. It's not going to leap up exponentially and inexplicably and without some kind of defense behind it. So that's just a long way of saying, we don't have a lot of levers to pull because Canada is a good country that wants people, by and large, to have access to post-secondary education, and keeping tuition, let's say, moderate is one big part of that. But there has to be tuition income for universities to be able to move ahead. So it is a difficult problem. You mentioned earlier in this conversation the issue of working with corporate sponsors and lots of other private sponsors. And we haven't done that a lot at the University of Saskatchewan, I'm sure but if you went to the United States and went into almost any university there, I mean, every single room, seat in a lecture hall would be named after somebody. And we don't need to move very aggressively in that direction yet. So we're relatively well funded by our respective provinces.
But the whole notion of fundraising, and you've hit it there, which is people with money who make a big donation want to see names on buildings, whether it's hospitals or university libraries or whatever it may be. But if you're going to a more virtual system, then what happens to all this real estate? As beautiful as the U of S campus is with its trees and its history and all the rest of it, do you need it?
I think we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years that people are not so interested in funding, donating for bricks and mortar. This has been said to me over and over and over again, and I've started to see it myself, having been president for 5 years and a dean for 5 years before that. What people are interested by and large in donating toward is, let's call it, the student experience. So how can a university afford to send students abroad, because becoming global citizens involves that? And in fact, the federal government has a pilot project that involves supporting that as well. But I'm just saying that donors, I think, nowadays tend to remember what they were like, what their experience was like as students. And either they feel that they want universities to ensure that that happens, or they want universities to be creative and make something new. So things like study abroad, or better lab space, or better ways of having an experience as an undergraduate student, let's say at a university here. That's where we see the money tends to go. And I think people get a lot of satisfaction, as donors, marrying up what their aspirations for students of today are with the funding capacity that they've got. So it's not really bricks and mortar.
If the quest for money, as you say, tuitions will always rise. You'll try and keep that in some reasonable shape. You're looking for money constantly from the outside world. or the private sector world. Have we got something just fundamentally wrong about funding education at whatever level it is? Should this be a different kind of priority? I know we've got federal, provincial, jurisdictional issues and all of those things, but why is this so difficult to keep universities going?
It's a long answer to that question, but it's a great question. It's the $1 million question,
or many millions of dollars.
But I remember seeing close to 10 years ago now a presentation about what the priorities would be for any given provincial government, and health was right at the top. K-12 education was right at the top. I mean, in this province, we have an issue with ensuring that students are educated beyond grade 8. Infrastructure is right at the top. All of those things that would be, very familiar to all of us. And post-secondary education was a priority somewhere down around 10 or 11 or 12. And this isn't, necessarily a cabinet sitting around making that prioritized list. It's what they know voters feel. So I think visionary governments at the federal and provincial level can start to put more funding into post-secondary education. I don't think there's any question about that. But I think what they would want to see is movement on the things that you and I were talking about earlier. Are we educating students the right way for the right kinds of jobs, for the right kind of world, for what this country needs? And again, closing that gap between universities and the innovation agenda of a country. What I'd like to see in Canada is a greater investment in R&D. Our percentage of GDP is relatively low, and it's not surprising as a result that we are down there around the top of the bottom third in the OECD Innovation Index. And
hewers of wood and drawers of water.
And exactly, there is kind of just an assumption and a reliance on the fact that all of these things are always going to be available to us, and these other things don't matter so much. But when you look at the countries that are at the top of that list, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, Israel, Sweden, they're incredible with very, very few natural resources in terms of what they have produced on the innovation side. And if anybody questions the importance of the innovation side, that's where prosperity comes from. That's where health comes from. That's where a good life comes from. That's where equity, diversity, and inclusion can be supported from. So I feel very strongly that the country and its provinces need to invest more in let's call it R&D for now, and then universities have the responsibility of ensuring that they can do something with that profits the country.
So let's say that COVID is done by next fall when you're starting up the next series school year, and then you're looking 5 years down the road. What will be fundamentally different? Will it be fewer buildings? Will it be more remote learning? Will the focus on what you're teaching them be different because of what we're learning from COVID? Can you even think that? Or in this kind of a mindset, is it just, how do we get through the next 3 months?
No. It's not how do we get through the next 3 months, because in essence, we think, and I hope we're right, we've figured that out. And you are right in asking that question. And as I say, I'm starting to lead asking that question across the university. And I think we're capable of answering it. As I was saying before, I don't think we need to begin by having an internal conversation. We need to listen. We call ourselves the university the world needs. It's not a boast. It's a kind of social contract where we need to listen to what is needed out there in terms of water security, food security, a vaccine to inoculate us against COVID in the future. So anyway, back to your question. Here's what I foresee, and I would imagine it's not far off the mark. People will still come to universities. They'll still come to the University of Saskatchewan in essentially the same numbers, and those numbers will increase every year, and we will have to have a beautiful campus, and we will have to pay for its infrastructure. But what will happen around that will be truly transformative is that more people who never would have come to the university and never would have received a university education will start to do so, but remotely. And when you think that now those people are potentially all around the world, the main question we have to ask ourselves is, why, if I can go to any university in the world and I couldn't before, would I want to go from wherever in the world to the University of Saskatchewan remotely? And so we have to ask ourselves, given our many different kinds of strengths, how do we make the whole greater than the sum of the parts so that people would want to come to this particular university to get what? And that's a really, really fascinating question to ask ourselves. And different universities in the world, I'm sure, will end up asking themselves the same question, and we'll have to arrive at the answers. But we will less be able to be all things to all people. And I'd go back actually to the Saskatchewan context. I mean, I love the University of Saskatchewan. I think it's a great university. It's one of Canada's top 15 research-intensive universities, and it's meant a lot to the people of this province for well over a century, more than many universities in other provinces have meant to the people of those provinces. This place has an aura about it and a deep meaning about it. But we need to work in concert with our provincial government. Our Minister of Advanced Education has been very, very good on this front. And with Saskatchewan Polytechnic, I'm a huge fan of polytechnics in this country and the role they can play, and the University of Regina, to make the whole province's post-secondary system attractive to people around the world. So that means, understanding that we can be leaders in ag tech, that we can be leaders in vaccinology, that we can be leaders in, all sorts of health-related areas. And there are times when we can actually work together to ensure that that's the case.
But not always all things to all people.
Yeah.
That seems to be where the focus will have to be.
Yeah. I mean, we will have to stop doing some things. I can't possibly predict what they are. I mean, we always stop doing some things. We evolve, but we have to be more deliberate about the direction that we're going to take. So we have to sit down, look at each other in the eye and say, what are we really, really good at here that people really, really need? And I think there are answers to those questions.
Great to talk with you. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thanks, Pamela.
All right, I'm told that this is really important. I am going to ask you to engage with us on social media. Better still, rate us, because 5 stars are important. In fact, I'm told it's really important that we have this relationship. I really appreciate you listening to our podcasts, No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Talk to you soon.